Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Chiene Tait Charity and Education Group Seminar 2014. We're absolutely delighted to see so many representatives from the charity sector in the room this evening, given it's such a cold, wet and dark January evening. My name is Kenny McDowell, and I head up the Charities and Education Group here at Chiene Tait. And I'm assured this evening that there are not going to be any fire alarms. If there is a fire alarm, can I ask you to move out of this door and immediately turn right, and the door is literally facing you when you turn right. Our theme this evening is fundraising. Now, many years we've always done technical seminars this time of the year. But we do find that a theme with something of interest in terms of the commercial aspects of charitable life is something that our clients value. Our theme this evening is on tips, tax, and indeed traps, and we are blessed this evening to have 4 very specialist speakers within the sector with us. Our presentation will last for approximately 1 hour. And can I ask you, against that background, just to keep your questions to the Q&A that we have after the final speaker. Our presentation this evening will start with Euan Morrison. Euan is an Audit Manager at Chiene Tait and has been with the firm for a long time. And he is a long-standing member of our Charities and Education Group. Euan, as I say, specialises in the sector and works with myself and a number of the firm's key audit charitable clients. And Euan will be presenting on the tax tips together with the fundraising regulations that you should be alert to when you are planning your fundraising campaigns. Following on from Euan, we are delighted to welcome Fiona Duncan and Elaine Wilson from the Lloyds TSB Foundation. Fiona is Deputy Chief Executive and joined the Foundation in 2013. And Fiona has been in the voluntary sector for over 20 years. Fiona's previous experience includes charities such as Think, where she led the strategic vision for that charity, but also she's worked with Capability Scotland and indeed the Royal Scottish Academy for Music and Drama. Importantly for this evening, Fiona was also a member of the Institute of Fundraising's UK Board of Trustees and has also led and delivered their governance review that was recently carried out. Also from Lloyds TSB Foundation we have Elaine Wilson, and Elaine has worked with the Foundation since 2000. Elaine is a manager and deals with many of the projects that the Foundation delivers, including the Partnership Drugs Initiative. And critically, Elaine spends a lot of her time in the field, learning about the outcomes from which the money has delivered. Now, Fiona and Elaine will be giving the grant giver's perspective this evening, and really understanding and giving to you the tips for application for grants, but also maintaining the stakeholder relationship once you have the money. I think that's critically important in today's environment. Following on from Fiona and Elaine, we are also delighted to welcome Leslie Christie, Director of Fundraising at St Columba's Hospice. Leslie joined the hospice and has had and maintains overall responsibility for their fundraising effort, and has led the strategic effort and development of the capital campaign to support and to rebuild the hospice. I'm sure many of you in this room will have seen the output of that fundraising campaign. Leslie's previous background started in commerce, so she was with William Lowe and Asda back in the day, but also Leslie moved into the charitable sector working with Children First and latterly with Queen Margaret University. And Leslie's talk, I think, will end on a high because it is a tremendous story of how the fundraising campaign at the hospice has delivered such an outcome for that tremendous Indigenous charity. So, without any further ado, can I ask you to ensure your phones are turned off, please? And I will hand over to Euan Morrison, who will take us through the regulatory and tax aspects of fundraising. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to cover three key things. First of these is tax reliefs and incentives for charitable giving, principally for individuals, but also for companies. We'll also talk about tax reliefs that are available for fundraising events. That's part of your fundraising activity. And we'll finish off by briefly touching on fundraising regulations. So we'll start off in terms of tax incentives by looking at individuals. The most familiar way that the individuals can give cash to charity and there can be tax relief is, of course, gift aid. Gift aid applies to donations of cash, and that can be to a charity or a community amateur sports club, the CASC, as we have here. Community amateur sports clubs have their own rules, which we'll not go into, but we may refer to some of the reliefs being applicable to them also. The way that gift aid works is that an individual makes a donation to charity net of the basic rate of tax, and from the charity's perspective, they claim tax at the rate of 25% of the donation they receive. If the donor is a high rate taxpayer, then they can claim the balance of the tax relief through their tax return. There are, of course, various conditions that apply to gift aid. The actual donation must be cash, and when I say cash, that means it can be notes, coins, but it can be any form of electronic transfer of funds. What it can't be is a waiver of a loan or donation in kind, so it's something important to be aware of. Obviously, a gift must be a proper gift, something that's not subject to repayment. There's a general principle with gift aid that the donor should not receive anything in return for his donation. He shouldn't be receiving any benefits back. There are certain low levels of benefits that a donor can receive without that affecting the gift aid rules, and we'll talk briefly about them later. Some further conditions of gift aid. The individual must, of course, pay sufficient tax in order for that tax to be reclaimed by the charity. And that's one of the things that you'll see in the declaration, the gift aid form that we'll look at. There must be an audit trail between the donation, the donor, and the final gift aid claim. And this is so that HMRC can trace through and check the actual integrity of a claim if they wish to. There needs to be evidence that the process of gift aid has been explained to the donor so they understand what they're doing. And I mentioned already the gift aid declaration. Most of you are probably familiar with these declarations, having made them yourselves in the past. This is the standard template that's on HM Revenue and Customs website. You can see here the need to note the name of the charity, the amount of the gift, and in the narrative below that, confirmation that they are a UK taxpayer and explaining what will happen with the gift. The second part of the form is making sure we have details of whoever has donated the monies and also their address. And it's important to have these details because that's a way that HMRC can trace back to the individual if they need to check the gift aid. Another way that individuals can give donations to charity and they can get tax relief is through the payroll giving scheme. And the way this works is that the employer will have an arrangement with what's called a payroll giving agency. Under this scheme, the individual will agree with their employer how much they decide to give to charity. This will be deducted off the employee's gross pay before their pay is then subject to the usual tax and national insurance deductions. And the payroll giving agency will collect these amounts and then remit them over to the charity. In this instance, because the tax relief is given at the gross stage, there's no reclaim by the charity itself as there is with gift aid. Other ways that individuals can get tax relief for donations to charity is through gifting of assets. An individual can get income tax relief through gifting of interests in land and buildings in the UK. Also through gifting of qualifying shares. These will be shares listed on UK Stock Exchange and certain other markets. And they could also get relief on sale to a charity under value of those assets. In addition, an individual can get relief from capital gains tax in a similar situation, and this would apply to any assets where capital gains tax would normally be relevant. And again, sale at under value, this applies in this instance also. As I said before, this relief is for the individual. There's no direct relief that the charity reclaims from making gifts in this way. The final way which an individual can get relief, tax relief through gifts, is making a gift in your will, either a fixed legacy or a residuary legacy being made. And the way that the tax relief is given is that the value of the legacy is deducted from the net value of the estate before inheritance tax is applied to it. There is, if you make a donation to charity over a certain level, under a recent, something recently introduced by the government, if your donation is more than 10% of the net value of the estate, then you are allowed then to apply a lower rate of inheritance tax to the rest of the estate, and that would be 36% as opposed to the usual rate of 40%. I talked previously about this general principle that a donor shouldn't receive any benefit in return for the gifts that they give. But there are certain de minimis limits where if you give a very low, if the donor receives a very low level of benefit for their gift, then that won't be regarded as breaching the rules, and the gift aid and relief will apply. And you can see here, for small donations, 25% of the donation, if that's the value of the benefit, then you'll still be allowed the relief. And you can see the other thresholds there. There's actually two parts to this test. This is the first part of these limits here on the screen is the relevant value test. But there's also a sort of cumulative value maximum in the year, and that's called the aggregate value test. And under this, the maximum value of benefits that a donor could receive in the year is £2,500. There are a couple of other rules just to mention about connections and benefits that a donor might receive. Where a donor enters into some kind of arrangement where they're receiving a benefit back from the charity, then there are rules that were previously mostly under substantial donor rules and now largely replaced by tainted donation rules, where this relief can be denied. And that's if the donor is receiving some form of financial advantage in return for their donation, then it can deny tax relief to the donor. These rules are very complex, so it's important to be aware if you are receiving particularly large donations from donors and there's some other connection, perhaps beforehand or later, between the charity and the donor, then you must look into these and make sure that you're complying. We talked about individuals. We'll turn to companies briefly. Companies can get relief for giving donations of either cash or an asset, and they can get relief from corporation tax. And the way this simply works is that, say, a company has taxable profits of, say, £50,000. If they make a donation to charity of £10,000, then they will only be charged a tax on that £40,000. And in these cases, the charity doesn't make any reclaim at all. It is important to note that a company cannot create a tax loss by making a donation to charity. So if, for instance, a company had taxable profits of nil for a year, it couldn't then make a donation to charity and then use that loss to carry that back or forward. Turning to the mechanics of how gift aid works, there's three main ways that you would reclaim gift aid. The first two are electronic methods, and they involve signing up to HMRC online through the government gateway and enrolling for the charities section here. And the first one of these would involve using a schedule spreadsheet, which you would get from the website, putting your details of the reclaims you're making and then uploading that. There's no limit to the number of claims you can make in this way during the year, but there's a maximum of 1,000 donations per claim that you can do. And that's just an example of a spreadsheet there. For larger charities, which you can imagine must certainly have more than 1,000 donations they want to make in each claim, you can use your own software provided it's compatible with HMRC, and this is software you've either developed yourself or there are off-the-shelf packages you can buy, and you can use this to make your submission, and this allows much greater numbers of donations to be claimed. The final method for gift aid is probably one that you might be familiar with from longer ago, and this is just using a manual form. And this would be particularly applicable if you didn't have internet access or you weren't comfortable with using the online system. It would just simply be a case of phoning up HMRC's charity helpline, asking to have one of these forms sent out to you, and then submitting that. And this gets scanned on by HMRC, so that's why it has to be in the particular format that they send it to you. Just a couple of final points on gift aid that are important to be aware of. The record keeping is important. You are required to keep records for 6 years. And these would include the actual declarations themselves. Fortunately, you don't need to keep these in hard copy. You can keep them in some electronic form, but it is important to retain these because, as I mentioned before, HMRC do like to look at these. They can audit them, and they would expect to be able to trace back actual donation right through to the declaration made by the donor. In terms of how long you've got to submit a claim, you have 4 years to make a claim. The time from which you go backwards from 4 years is slightly different for charitable trusts and companies, but we would certainly advise you not to leave it to the last minute to make claims. Obviously, it's better from a cash flow perspective to get your funds in earlier, and also you may have difficulty looking for and making sure you've got all the declarations that you would need to retain. I'll briefly talk about the Gift Aid Small Donations Scheme. This was something introduced relatively recently, and this applies to both charities and community amateur sports clubs. This applies to cash donations, and when I say cash in this instance, this is real cash, this is notes or coins. It doesn't apply to any form of electronic payment. And the way this works is that a charity registered under the scheme will be able to claim up to 25% of the donations received, up to a total amount of $1,250. And this is a top-up payment from HMRC. Where this is applicable to would really be instances where you have lots of small cash donations and it's not practical to get a declaration from each individual, but it does, like gift aid, allow you to get some funds back from the government. There are various conditions and requirements that apply to this scheme. It's important to be aware of these. They are a bit more stringent than you might expect. You already have to be registered for gift aid. You already must have made a couple of gift aid claims in the past 4 years. So make sure you're aware of these before operating this scheme. So we've covered gift aid, we've covered relief, other forms of relief for individuals and companies. We'll just talk about tax reliefs that are available for fundraising events. An event in this instance would include balls, performances, auctions, this sort of event. And this creates two things for accountants who are interested in tax, and it creates two considerations that we have to think about. The first of these is indirect tax. Is there income from this activity subject to VAT? Now, charities are, of course, subject to VAT, same as any other organisation, so we have to firstly consider VAT. The next consideration for our event that we're organising is direct tax. Are our profits subject to income tax? Well, fortunately, there is an exemption available under VAT, and if you have less than 15 events of the same type in the same place in a year for fundraising, the primary purpose is to raise money, and that's how it's promoted, then you are exempt from VAT on these sources of income. And this exemption covers admission brochures, goods sold, and any sponsorship that's connected directly with the event. Now, fortunately, this is a rather rare instance where income tax and VAT actually agrees. Provided you meet these VAT exemptions we talked about, the fundraising event won't be treated as a taxable trading activity, so that's good news if you're arranging these events. The final thing we're going to cover is fundraising regulations. In 2009, these regulations, charities and benevolent fundraising, were brought out, and these deal with regulating situations where funds are being sought on behalf of a benevolent body. Benevolent body is a rather sort of long-winded term, but this would be generally a charity, but also could include other bodies set up for philanthropic purposes. These rules are quite detailed, and they're not the most straightforward set of rules to follow. There are some unusual definitions within these rules that might not be obvious to everybody. Commercial participators. A commercial participator is an organisation that has some sort of arrangement to promote something where proceeds go to the charity. And an example of this would be a retailer that has, say, a Christmas card scheme where part of the sales from the Christmas card would go to charity. Professional fundraisers is another key definition, and this is an organisation who actually goes out and raises money for charities for financial reward. And these first two, commercial participators and professional fundraisers, these have quite well-defined obligations and duties under the rules, so it's important to be aware of these. The final one here we have are benevolent fundraisers. These would be people associated with the charity, and these are most likely to be employees of the charity or volunteers of the charity raising money. The key things that these regulations contain are they require formal fundraising agreements. We have commercial participators and professional fundraisers. They cover the rights to refunds that a donor would have having made a donation. They detail the sort of information that a fundraiser has to provide when carrying out fundraising. It covers how long these organisations have to transfer money from themselves to the charity, which is generally as soon as possible and certainly within 28 days. It covers unauthorised fundraising, and also offences and penalties are set out, and these can be up to £5,000, so it is important that you are aware of these. I'll finally touch on for collections regulations. These cash collection regulations that date from the 1980s, these will apply to street collections, door-to-door collections. In these instances, a charity would need to get permission from local authority, and there are various regulations and rules that talk about the sort of material that the charity has to provide in these circumstances, and how they carry out the collection and what reporting they have to do afterwards. This can be quite a burden on charities to liaise with different local authorities, and if you're making collections like these in more than one area or perhaps across Scotland, what you can do is apply to OSCAR to become an exempt promoter, and this means this takes away a lot of the burden with dealing with different local authorities, and instead you're dealing with OSCAR and various similar requirements with them. Public benefit collections regulations, there were some provisions in earlier acts for charities that are still to come into force, and these will hopefully supersede these ones from the 1980s in due course. I've mentioned maybe once or twice that these rules, for both in terms of the tax and in terms of the fundraising, are complex, and can be quite a fine line between whether you're complying or not complying, whether reliefs are available or not. So there are some very useful references that you can go to. The HMRC charity section of their website is actually relatively straightforward to read. Institute of Fundraising is a very good website with excellent guidance on it, and if you've certainly not looked at that, it's well worth reading through. And finally, we have OSCAR, who have details of the public benevolent regulations in their guidance section. So just to summarise, there are a number of different tax incentives that individuals have to earn companies to give money to charities. So you need to be aware of these so that you can persuade people to part with their cash. The rules can be complex and there can be fine lines, so make sure you're well aware of them to make sure you don't fall foul of them. And certainly, if you're unsure about the rules, then seek professional advice, because it is quite easy to fall foul of these. So I'll just now hand over to Fiona and Elaine from Lloyds.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to talk this evening. Elaine asked me to take our pictures off the slides earlier, but I refused. I'm Fiona, I'm this one, and I'm the Deputy Chief Exec.
And my name is Elaine, and I'm the other one, and I'm the Programme Manager for the Partnership Drugs Initiative.
So Chiene Tait asked us to spend about 20 minutes talking to you about three things: how grant giving has changed, tips for applying for a grant, and how to maintain communication with a funder. And what we've decided to do is not just share with you Lloyds TSB Foundation for Scotland's approach, but to talk to you about grant making in general. So before we start, we thought it might be quite useful to take a look, just take a moment to take a look at the perfect storm that we find ourselves in the middle of. Although there is no single definitive source, there are mountains and mountains of information available into the range of critical factors that every day are impacting on our sector. These include statistical analysis, they include trends reports, they include research and surveys. Many of you will have read SCVO's State of the Sector 2013, the NCVO Almanac, the Charity AIDS Foundation UK Giving Surveys. You'll have looked at HMRC gift aid returns, Directory of Social Change reports. I could go on for 20 minutes just citing sources, but I won't. I'll tell you what we know from these surveys. We know that the statutory purse is shrinking, and it's shrinking rapidly. We also know that a third of the voluntary sector's income comes from the statutory pocket, so we know that our major source of income is going to shrink further in the future. We also know that demand for services is growing. The SCVO report showed that 2/3 of the people that had participated in it expected that there would be an increase in requests for their services in the future. We know that for many charities, traditional fundraising income is harder to come by than before. According to the Charities AIDS Foundation, individual giving is down, with fewer people giving, and the people that are giving less. We know, according to the Directory of Social Change, that corporate income is down, and according to lots of charities, fundraising events are underperforming. So all of this makes it more difficult for charities to plan ahead. So in this context, philanthropy is changing, and grant makers consider themselves philanthropists. So now I'll move on to our brief, which was how has grant giving changed? I think it's important, before I embark on this, to let you know that for many grant givers, they're feeling the squeeze too. Some, like us, like Lloyds TSB Foundation for Scotland, has less money to give away. Other funders, like the Tudor Trust, is eating into its endowment every year just to maintain grant giving at previous levels. So grant makers are looking quite seriously at what they can do. The more progressive grant makers are increasingly aware that passive grant making is not even beginning to solve some of society's problems, and at worst it's actually creating dependency between the funder and the organisation in receipt of funds. And for this reason, a growing number of grant makers are moving away from passive grant making towards being proactive and actually working hard to identify themes or organisations that they want to work with in the future. So they're out there and they're more present and more engaged. You might consider that that makes them more choosy, and for some grant givers, being choosy is actually driven by need. If they've got the same size of pot or even less money to give away, and they've got more asks than they had in the past, then they're going to have to make tough choices. But being a responsible grant giver demands knowledge and insight. And in turn, this knowledge and insight can make us seem a little bit more demanding. We no longer want you to tell us that you've counted the beans. We want you to tell us how your work has improved the life chances of each and every single bean. And some of us are looking for a tangible return on investment. And we like innovation, which we know isn't always pleasing the voluntary sector. We're acutely aware that life is tougher and that the old solutions aren't working anymore, so we like you to come up with new solutions. And we like exit strategies. As I said a moment ago, we don't want to create dependency. We want our funding to help solve problems. But we know that we can't do this alone. So we're more connected. We're more connected with each other. We talk informally, and there are a number of forums that grant makers and statutory funders engage in. And one of the things that we have in common is you. So we talk about you. We're also more engaged with the voluntary sector, And historically, I mean, I've been in the voluntary sector for 20 years, and historically grant makers were very difficult to access. They weren't present. Increasingly, that's not the case. You'll find that they're at conferences and that they're speakers. But all of these connections are leading us to seek out partnerships. I believe that you'll see more collaborative funding in the future, where grant makers come together in order to increase the pot of cash that's available and to help making accessing funds easier and not more difficult. And we like to see ourselves as your partner. We like to offer you something that grant makers refer to as Funder Plus, so help signpost you to other funders, help work with you on your applications. We like to support you to get better. And you know, for many years, grant makers have been asking you to work with each other, to partner each other and learn from each other and create efficiencies. Despite that not gaining traction in the voluntary sector, it's unlikely to go away. And as I said a moment ago, we are committed to playing our part to try and change society and make things better. So increasingly we're engaged with policymakers, and the conversations that we can have with policymakers differ quite a lot to the ones that you can have. Historically, charities campaigning or lobbying activities have focused on a narrow or a single issue and are about demanding change to legislation or an increase in the share of the envelope or more funding. Although most funders do have a range of areas of issues that they're interested in, typically they're not interested in just one or two, and therefore they can have conversations with policymakers on a broad range of things. And policymakers know that when they're talking to grant makers, that grant makers are having that conversation with some cash in their pocket, and therefore the conversations are generally productive, and they're about how best to mobilise voluntary funds to shore up gaps in statutory provision. So we're not agitators. And we find ourselves having conversations about intelligent funding to meet growing gaps in provision, to look at how practice-based evidence can influence policy and how to pump prime innovations that will ultimately become statutory responsibilities. So over the last 5 or 10 years, grant giving's changed quite radically from where it used to be.
So what does this mean for you? We're just going to explore it from the other perspective, how it would reflect and have an impact on yourself, reflecting on what Fiona's just said. In terms of being more proactive, I think for voluntary sector organisations, they often see that it's the big, large national charities that have the biggest stake and can be that standout organisation to attract the funding, but that's not necessarily so. There's a saying going that a good community group knows what every member of the community has in their tea, and that's what funders like. They like that knowledge and awareness that you are the expert in your field. The more smaller organisations also have the ability to adapt quickly, be bold and take innovative ideas, again something that funders like. I'm going to come back to being more choosy and talk about applications, some tips later. And also, we know that there's a big economic downturn. We know the challenges placed on yourself, and as Fiona said, we know that funders often like innovation, but that's not necessarily so. I think funders are starting to change, and more funders will look at funding core costs, which is a big challenge to everybody in here. More funders will think about how they can incorporate core costs into general applications. So I think there is a shift in the sand about that. You just need to have to look and see which funders are out there, and we'll consider that. Funders, sorry, thank you. I think there's a need to be more transparent. As Fiona said, funders speak to each other, and we do it quite informally as well. So that means sometimes we pick up the phone and go, I've got an application from such and such. Have you got one? Because they've got you down as the list. What do you think? So there's that dialogue going on in there as well. So be very transparent when you're putting information down. We're very aware of one high-profile organisation that was currently trying to raise funds for a big project, and they put applications into 2 funders, but there were different figures in them. So suddenly the funders were going, wait a minute, what's happening here? This doesn't seem to tie up. So you need to be transparent with the information you provide, because funders do talk to each other. And the other thing which sometimes feels a bit strange is that we are human. We do like to have that dialogue and conversation. You know, we aren't that scary ogre at the end of the phone, and if you see us out in public, we sometimes are allowed out, or at conferences, come up and speak to us, ask us about what our grant giving's like just now, ask us about is there any plans to change criteria, tell us if you've had a grant from us before, because sometimes we do forget, and that allows that dialogue and that communication to continue. Our Chief Executive, Mary Craig, is very renowned for having Glasgow wit and humour, and she welcomes that open dialogue all the time. And as I say, tell us about taking an interest in what we're doing, and tell us about what your funding has achieved. Tell us about what the investment we've given, what difference it's made to your organisation, because that's the thing funders are really striving to get a better handle on. What impact has that money made? Not just that we ran 10 groups or we built this project, but actually what difference has those groups made? What difference has that building made? Because that's where the interest is, and more funders are really keen on understanding that impact. So you need to understand that as well. And I think the days, as Fiona said, is funders being this thing that a hierarchy and we're the ones at the top with the money, that day is gone. We no longer have that level of investment to give out, but we're also starting to recognise that this is a two-way relationship, that we can only do one part of it, and we need you to work with us to get that the biggest impact that it can make. So we want to work together to find solutions, and I think you need to try and start to understand that and unpick that power balance has shifted. So if that's what we are thinking about in terms of what we mean by different aspects of how grant giving has changed and how it can impact on you, we now need to think about what are the kind of key tips for applying for a grant. Now, I looked through the delegate list and noticed there was a number of fundraising experts in the room. So this may all sound like teaching an old dog new tricks, but it's just some of the basic things and the simple things that often get forgotten. I think the first thing is do some research. One application doesn't fit all funders, and believe you me, I have seen it. I have received applications when it's not even addressed to Lloyds DSB Foundation for Scotland or some other trust or foundation name at the top of the application form. So, you know, do your research. You can't just cut and paste. You need to tailor it to the needs of that specific funding body, trust, foundation, whoever it is you're applying to. Look at what their criteria is. Does it fit what you're trying to do? Think about, does it connect to what they're trying to achieve in terms of their criteria? Does it fit what you're trying to achieve as well? I think as well, understand timescales and plan around timescales. So if a funder's saying 3 months and you need the money in a month's time, that isn't obviously the right approach to take. So you need to think about how you develop a fundraising strategy and timescale that will meet with different funders' needs. The other thing is about jargon. Be clear, concise, and use plain English. I, in my day job through the Partnership Drugs Initiative, work quite closely with policy around that area of drug and alcohol issues, and believe you me, I've heard every acronym, every jargon term going, and it is mind-blowing. But I then have to try and translate that to trustees and make it understandable. So you could cut that down by going, what does this actually mean? What difference does this mean? What is an ADB, ADP, or a ABI, or a CASSM? So, you know, there's lots of them out there. Just make it as simple as possible. And the other thing is, be clear about your budgets. Look at what you're asking for. As Fiona said, money is getting tighter. So people do look at budget costs in a lot more detail than they probably did before. So where you maybe had £20,000 in an application for general activities, people are going, what's a general activity? What is that? What's that actually going to entail? What is that going to cover? So you need to be really clear on your budget and be realistic about the costs. What is it you're trying to do, and will that actually be able to deliver against what you're achieving? Thank you. I think the other thing is about evidencing the need. Understand what you're trying to achieve. Understand and reflect, is there a need there for that? And demonstrate that in the application form. So that's not just about thinking about quantitative outputs. It's thinking about the qualitative outcomes and what difference you're going to make as well. And I think the other thing is, don't chase money. It's quite easy. You've gone round 1 year and you know that that you've got a 12-month waiting period before you can apply again. So you just submit the application form just in case. They'll be free and you can get some cash. Those days are gone as well. So I think you need to think carefully about why you're applying, what you're applying for, and is it the right time. If you don't need the money, and I know that sounds a bit strange, don't apply. It's really easy. I had a conversation with someone the other week and they were talking about applying to the big lottery. And the big lottery had said, oh, you should come forward and put your application in. And they said to me, but I'm not sure if we're ready. And I said, then why apply? Just because the lottery told you doesn't mean to say you have to do it. So I think don't chase the money. And I think in today's world of range of fundraising strategies, and we got some of it from Euan's presentation, you have to think creatively about a fundraising strategy and a mix of strategies. When we look at grant applications, we do look at where else are you going for funding, what else are you doing, what other sources are you trying to attract money. I think you have to think differently about how you generate income. And I think also you have to think about sometimes in-kind support, in-kind resources. Is there some way that you can actually work with someone who will give you something that will help you achieve your ultimate aim? I think that actually is about, again, linking to that much more effective partnership approach. And finally, make it easy for us. So if we have a deadline, meet the deadline. Don't phone up at 2 minutes to the deadline and say, I can't get hold of my chair to sign an application form, or I can't do this, or will you accept an email form when you already know the answer to the question? So, so make it easy for us. Check all that information out first. If you have questions, make sure you plan plenty of time in to phone up and ask. If we ask for accounts, make sure you have them. And remember, we are human, so you can pick up the phone, give us a call, and ask us if there's anything that we can help with. And finally, as I said, it's about keeping in touch. We're quite open as grant makers, and I think in the world of trusts and foundations, that is definitely changing. Much more trusts have websites. Many more now have telephone numbers as well, where they are welcoming people to pick up the phone, have a conversation. And if you don't meet the criteria, at least you know. At least you can then go, well, they're not right for us just now. So I think it's about keeping that communication open and that dialogue open so that you can have those regular conversations with us.
So hopefully what Elaine and I have got across to you is we're human and we really want to be your friend. So in terms of tips for keeping in touch, if we assume that you're already going to meet the number 6, make it easy for us and submit reports on time and give us the information that we asked for, other tips, really straightforward tips for keeping in touch are consider us really as friends. Let's pledge to be honest and considerate with each other and share information when we have information, so not necessarily wait until the deadline for the report to tell us something that you think we'd maybe like to know. We'd rather hear from you if something significant's happened within a project that we're funding than read it in the local newspaper. So treat us like a friend, but also treat us like a partner. We're investing in your success. So keep us up to date with your success and keep us up to date with how that investment's going. And let's show each other a little bit of compassion. We know that if we make a grant to you, that there's a chance that not everything will happen exactly the way that you wanted it to happen, that the best laid plans don't always play out exactly as we hope. So tell us if something's gone wrong or if you're facing a challenge, because we're more likely to be able to accommodate that if we can have a conversation about it rather than receive a report about it at the deadline. And involve us. So if you've got an event that's taking place and it's maybe an event around a funded project that we've not been a funder of, but there are other funders and you think we might like to come, then ask us, because as Elaine said, we like to get out from behind our desk. So please involve us in your organisation. The closer we can get to you and the better we can get to know you, the more likely we are to be successful together.
And I think remember that we probably know quite a lot of people as well, so even if you phone us and you don't meet our criteria, we're actually quite helpful in going, have you thought about such and such? Can you link with other people? Through my programme, I work quite closely with both local statutory partners and national statutory and other trusts and foundations. So part of our programme is about how we can connect the voluntary sector groups that we're working with, whether they've been successful or not, into those local connections, and hopefully start to facilitate some of that dialogue. And I think more trusts and foundations are starting to think like that, about how it is about much more of a partnership, and we're all in it together to try and make a bigger impact and difference. And I was just saying earlier about sharing information with our trustees, so we really like to hear success, and we would normally get that from an annual report. But if something fantastic's happened in between that reporting period, then let us know. Tell us if you've achieved that target. Tell us if 10 of the young people that you've been working with have all achieved success in school and are getting their higher grades. Tell us a really positive case study or story, because those stories are the things that resonate with our trustees, that make that difference to them, going, I can see that, I can see and understand that difference, that community group, that national organisation, that picture is started to paint in their mind. And that all comes from regular dialogue and that relationship between trust and foundation and voluntary sector partner.
And finally, know that sometimes we might challenge you, but equally know that you can challenge us back. So if you've found this whistle-stop tour from our perspective useful, there are reports and resources in the wide voluntary sector ether that go into a little more detail. This is a particularly good one. Last summer, NFP Synergy did some research with 21 grant makers on behalf of the Institute of Fundraising for their 30th birthday and the Office for Civil Society. And this report, called Inside the Mind of a Grant Maker, makes for interesting reading, and it can be downloaded from NFP's website. Thank you. Leslie.
Well, good evening, everyone. Definitely a few familiar faces in the room tonight, a few people I've not seen for quite some years. Delighted to come and talk to you. I'm just going to try and work out how this works. Ha-ha! Technology at its best. I was asked today to come along and have a chat with you about some of the experiences that we have had at St Columba's Hospice with regard to our recent fundraising campaign. In the context of fundraising in our session and thinking about some hints and tips. Now, one brick at a time, I actually said to our chairman, you know, we're going to raise the money for this hospice one brick at a time. He nearly had a hissy fit. He said, if you do that, you're going to be here forever. So actually, we didn't do it one brick at a time, but I will share with you some of the ways we did do it. When I started to think about hints and tips, and also traps, I suddenly realised that actually my tips include a lot of the traps which we inadvertently fell into. So Charterhouse rules, I'm going to share some stories with you today. If you tell anyone, you're toast. Now, like Elaine, I'm going to apologise because I might sound as though I'm trying to teach my granny how to suck eggs. But I'm not really. These are some of the things that we did, some of the things we might have done fairly well, and some of the things we possibly didn't do quite so well. As I said, I'm sharing, so let's keep it just within us. Okay, this might sound really obvious, and I'm sure you've heard it before, but I'm sure any in the room heard of the Pareto principle? It gets bandied around in fundraising quite a lot. Pareto, early 1900s economist, discovered that 80% of the pea pods in his garden actually, or rather 20% of the pea pods in his garden contained 80% of the peas. So basically the other 80% weren't terribly productive. And actually 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. And so he was able to extrapolate this out. And really all that is saying is, of all the activities that you undertake in all walks of life, and I have to say especially in fundraising, you really need to look at what's working, what's bringing in the money, and actually take a really long, hard look, and sometimes make some really difficult decisions about things that you maybe aren't doing so well, or that take up a lot of time but don't bring in a lot of return. There are several things that I would say we kind of got bogged down with historically, and actually when we looked at them, they weren't necessarily the most profitable ways of raising funds. So especially during a recession, we kind of need to box clever, and we need to look at what is working well for us and actually focus on these things. The other thing I want to touch on briefly is the small world principle, 6 degrees of separation, or 2 if you happen to live in Edinburgh. Has anybody heard of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon? Apparently this went around college campuses in the States, and you had to connect yourself to Kevin Bacon in 6 moves or less, or in some cases Kevin Bacon's dog. Edinburgh is such a village. Now, I remember when I first started working at the hospice, I sat down with all our trustees and some of our major donors, and I asked them who they knew. Apparently nobody knew anyone. Not a soul. All their connections were in London, or, you know, there was nobody up here they knew. Well, actually, everybody knows more people than they think they know. And somebody that you might find useful, your trustees wouldn't necessarily occur to them that they would find, you know, that you would find that person useful. So you have to dig a wee bit deeper. Do some research. Find out who your trustees are. Find out who they know. Find out what boards they sit on. Find out their home address. Do they live in Ann Street? Yes. You know, actually be creative about it. So who else sits on the board? Usually, I mean, we've signed up to things like Wealth Engine. Honestly, it's like Sherlock Holmes. It's great. You find out who sits on boards, who knows who. But actually, Google. It's amazing what you can find out if you Google. So actually, when you go to a meeting with your trustees, don't go in and just say, who do you know? Go in armed with, well, I know that you sit on the board of blah. And actually, I know there's this chap on the board who I also know has given to organisations X, Y, and Z that actually, similar to the cause that we're interested in, do you think you could introduce us? And actually take it a stage further. Don't just get them to give you the email address or the phone call, or the phone number so that you're doing the cold call. Actually think about creative ways of how you can actually get that person to come with you to a meeting, or actually make that call for you. And also look at your advisory boards, and if you don't have an advisory board, get one, because actually one of the biggest resources that a charity can have is its campaign board or its development advisory board. Motivation. I'm not talking about getting up in the morning. I'm talking about what is it makes people decide to give to your charity. So when we catch a fish, we bait the hook with what the fish like, not what the fisherman likes. It sounds really, really obvious. But actually, find out what motivates your donors to give, and actually don't forget it. And I'm going to come back to that later on and just share something with you. When you are fundraising for a very specific cause. You may operate in a very specific geographic region. You may operate in a very specific area, whether it's healthcare or child protection. Think about what is going to motivate your donors and prospective donors to give to your organisation, because it's really, really important that actually you're approaching the right people. It's a bit like when you're doing a grant application. You know, make sure you do your research and don't apply to a trust that doesn't fund the things that you want money for. The same applies to people. So when you're fundraising for major donors, make sure that you're targeting your approaches so that people will be interested in what you've got to say. Events. We have recently launched a number of new events. The Great Pentlands Push, the Water of Leith Walk. Our Water of Leith Walk is an in memoriam walk, so we are targeting that at people specifically who have a relationship with the hospice, people who have lost somebody at the hospice, because they are walking in memory of somebody. Whereas the Great Pentlands Push, we are targeting it at people who really like to yomp 26 miles over the hills. I'm cheerleading at the end. Not doing the walk. But we had 350 people last year walked between 13 or 26 miles. In fact, I think about 80% of them, 80% again, did the 26-mile walk. And we very specifically looked at where do we find these people? What kind of person wants to do a 26-mile walk across the Pentland Hills? The other thing that's actually really important in a fundraising organisation is teamwork. And I'll talk a wee bit about the fundraising team specifically. And really, this is somewhere where I think we went wrong a bit. When I first joined the hospice, we had a team, 2 people, I use the term loosely, but half of the fundraising team were recruited to look after revenue fundraising, i.e. running costs. And my remit was to go and recruit a fundraising team, 2 fundraisers, to concentrate specifically on capital fundraising. And what we very quickly discovered was that actually we're all working at cross purposes, because what you had was 2 people going off, doing events, doing major gift fundraising, doing trust applications. And on the other side, you had 2 people doing events, major gift fundraising, trust applications. Now, not on the trust side, but certainly on the events side, you know, if we were doing gala dinners, if we were doing fundraising events, major gift, everybody was kind of working against each other. So what we did was we moved people around, and we actually said, okay, right, we're going to look at income streams. And I know this sounds like common sense, but, you know, took us a wee while. And what we found was that actually if we had one team and one target, everybody had ownership of that. Everybody worked collegiately, and actually we were all pulling in the same direction, and we were working together, and we were sharing contacts, and actually all of a sudden everything just clicked into place. And if it's not broken, fix it anyway. And that sounds like a really strange thing to say, but I don't know if any of you have heard of Kaizen, which was a Japanese principle which got rattled around in business before I moved into the voluntary sector. It was this idea of continuous improvement, really. And actually, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again because it works, at some point it's going to get stale. It's going to get tired. 32 years of our annual Wits dinner, do you know what? It just needs a bit of a kick up the... So actually what we're looking at is how do we keep things fresh? How do we keep things moving? Introducing new events, binning the old ones. We've had events like the Wits Dinner, Bark in the Park, new events like the Wash of Leith Walk, which is an in memoriam walk, and the Celtic Challenge, which is a cycle. We had the Live Life Ball in October 2012, which is a huge event. I have a new clutch of grey hair called the Live Life Ball. And the Great Pentlands Push, which is an annual walk. Now, back to this thing about the 80-20 principle as well. Bark in the Park, lovely event. Lots of people come along and they have a sponsored dog walk. But if you actually look at the time and effort that goes into that event, and the number of people that it actually reaches, the number of people that have the opportunity to take part, we have had to question, is this actually working for us? Is the £2,500 that we made from Bark in the Park last year a good use of our resources? And in a small team of 5 people, actually it's a hard decision. It's been going for several years. We are not doing it next year. So tough decisions. Whereas on the other hand, last year the Great Pentlands Push, over 160,000. We've got to do the maths and actually think about where are we putting our time and our resources. Now, I know this is a really weird thing for a fundraising director to stand up and say. Okay, I'm going to say it anyway. It is not always about money. Well, actually, it probably is, but what we're talking about here really is awareness raising. When I said folk need to know what you do, when I first started at the hospice and I said, you know, St Columba's Hospice, almost everybody I spoke to had heard of St Columba's Hospice. And almost everyone I spoke to instantly thought that's somewhere people come to die. Well, yes, that's part of it, but about 40% of our patients, and I bet you none of you lot know this, but about 40% of our patients are actually discharged to go back home, because there's an awful lot more to palliative care than just end-of-life care. Now, that's actually something that I have been shouting about for 5 years, and I still haven't got the message out there as much as I would like. And there's lots of other things that I could actually wax lyrical for 20 minutes just about what we do at St Columba's. But actually, you really need to give people the opportunity to hear and to learn about what you do. And so one of the things we did at the hospice which worked really well, and I'll have to hold my hand up and say, this is something I nicked from higher education, and have cultivation events. We started inviting major donor prospects into the hospice for lunch. And we took them to one of the seminar rooms, because we didn't have a boardroom, and we took them to one of the seminar rooms that our education team used, and we put up a buffet lunch, and it's the same lunch that the patients had. And people would arrive, get a cup of coffee, get a tour of the hospice, meet some of the key clinical staff. They would hear firsthand from the clinical team about what we actually do. They would meet the chaplain or the social worker, the nurse that runs the day hospice service. And then we'd go through and they'd get a presentation on our rebuild project, obviously having just had the context of what we actually do. And then we'd go and have lunch. And then at the end, Paul, our chef, would come through the kitchen staff and say, you just had what the patients had for lunch today. And actually, it was about letting people experience that, first of all, the hospice is not the scary place they thought it was. It was about giving them an opportunity to talk to the people that were actually delivering the services firsthand. And it gave people the opportunity to come in and just chat to us. And we didn't immediately say, right, you've had your lunch, get your checkbook out. But what we did do was keep in touch with these people, develop the relationships with them. And on the back of that, we had the Live Life Ball, which raised £400,000. We also had, as a spin-off from the ball, an event last year, earlier this year, last year, 40 years of medical humour, I'm forgetting when New Year was. And that raised thousands and thousands as well. And these were all people who started out by coming to a cultivation lunch, then coming to the ball, and then going on to do bigger things for us. So it's really important. It's about building relationships and maintaining relationships. Oh, what can I say? Can we not have some celebrity ambassadors? Yes, but actually keep it into perspective. Do you know, the amount of suggestions that we have had over the past years about people who could support the hospice. If I hear the name Euan McGregor once more, I think I will cry. But he supports Chaz. Yes, and they're a children's hospice, so the link might be children, not hospice. Anyway, I mean, I joke about it, but honestly, you can waste a huge amount of time chasing down celebrities to no good end, because what are they actually going to deliver? Now, whereas we have got Una, who is an absolute joy to work with, who lives very nearby and has been fantastically supportive and fronted one of our appeals for us recently. So I guess what I'm saying is don't get caught up in it, but if you do have somebody local that you know that you can actually have access to, by all means, but keep it real. Oh, another wee trap. Other people's dreams. I think sometimes as fundraisers, we don't always have the courage of our convictions, and there is a time when you have to say, actually, let's not do this, because this is not appropriate for us as an organisation. You know, as a hospice, we're a very local charity with local support. Now, to be fair, we do have a database of 35,000 people, which does cover the length and breadth of the country and beyond. But most of our supporters actually come from within a fairly confined geographic area. So we have to bear that in mind when we're fundraising. We're providing a local service. Our education service is much wider, but by and large, we're Edinburgh, East Lothian, West Lothian, bit into the borders. Occasionally we get people from Fife. So why are we spending time trying to seek out the Scottish diaspora in Hong Kong? How long is that going to take? Are we actually going to find anybody in Hong Kong who actually has a connection with St Columba's Hospice? So actually think about how much time you could spend doing something. If somebody came to me and said, I know this really wealthy businessman in Hong Kong and his granny died in the hospice, I'm on it. But actually, you know, the amount of time that you could spend researching the Scottish diaspora with no return. So, you know, bear in mind that actually, just because somebody else has a really good, what they think is a really good idea, isn't always necessarily, just keep it, you know, keep it in perspective. Okay, I'm going to ask for a wee bit of audience participation here. Because if you remember I said, think about what your donors want. Think about what is going to be the hook that is going to pull in your donors. I am going to tell you very briefly about these 4 appeals. And then I'm going to ask for a show of hands as to which one didn't work. Light to light. People are asked to light a tree in memory. Light a light on the tree in Charlotte Square, the Christmas tree, in memory of a loved one. The fulfilment from that appeal is we send them a card with the name of the person that they've lost and a wee message, if they so wish, with a photograph of the tree on it. Our foundation's appeal, which was for the rebuild, we asked people to give us a message of goodwill or a memory or something that meant something to them on a dove-shaped card, because that was our campaign logo, Blue Dove. And we put it into a box, and we have buried that box in the foundations of the new hospice. The Buy a Brick appeal, we asked people to buy a brick in memory of a loved one, or in celebration of loved ones. And they've got a virtual brick. They got a certificate. And we have a donor book, a virtual donor book on our website. And all of the bricks, virtual bricks, are in this donor book. And our one-word appeal, we asked people to think about the word that for them best summed up the ethos of St Columba's Hospice, all the goodwill and all the support and everything that they felt St Columba's Hospice stood for. We asked them to give us that word, and that word is going to go on the wall of our Columba room, which is our spiritual space. I'm not allowed to call it a chapel anymore, but our spiritual space within the new hospice. Now, 3 of these, fantastically successful, well in excess of 6 figures. One raised about 60, 70,000, which was way, way less than we'd hoped for. We were hoping for about double that. So, okay, show of hands. How many people think the Light to Light appeal was the one that didn't work? No? Okay, only one person. The Buy a Brick appeal. How many people think the Buy a Brick appeal didn't work? Slightly more hands, okay. The Foundations appeal. How many people think the Foundations appeal didn't work? Quite a lot of hands. And last but not least, the one-word appeal. How many people thought the one-word appeal didn't work? Well done. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because we got it wrong. We thought we had such high hopes for the one-word appeal. We were so excited. The one-word appeal, we asked people about the hospice. We asked them what the hospice meant. We didn't ask them about their loved one. We didn't ask them about the person they had lost and about remembering the person they had lost. And actually, for us, for our appeals, it's the in memoriam bit that is important. One word wasn't in memoriam. So there you go. So we got a shock. So our next appeal is going to be the Forget-Me-Not appeal. And I mean that most sincerely. And we're actually going to send out a packet of Forget-Me-Not seeds and a certificate with the name of the person that the gift is in memory of or commemorating, and a packet of seeds with a wee certificate. So yes, hopefully we'll be back on track. And that's it, really, for me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of our formal proceedings this evening, but we do have time for some questions and answers. I think we've got about 10 to 15 minutes. So you've heard the fundraising story. We started with the regulation, the tax breaks, moved into the grant giver. The grant giver is looking for the engagement, the making it easy message, and then moved into the terrific story that is St. Columba's and their most recent campaign, but in the round, all of the campaigns that they manage on a regular, annual and exceptional basis. And it was terrific just to see some of the outcomes that have been articulated. So are there any questions for any of our presenters that you would like to ask as part of tonight's proceedings? Yes, sir.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry. I'll start again. Mike Steele, British Society of Animal Science. Can I ask you, if your activities are out with Scotland as well as within, do the rules and regulations in essence stand as presented by yourself, or are there subtle differences if you're active down south?
Are you talking about fundraising regulations?
I was
particularly tax.
Well, you cited the Charities and Benevolent Fundraising Scotland regulations.
These are Scotland regulations.
And are the English ones similar?
I don't know the detail about English ones, so I'm not sure if that's something that.
So we'd have to take advice, basically.
Yeah. They're very similar.
Right.
The Charities Act in Scotland mirrors a lot of, and the fundraising regs mirror a lot, but there are quite subtle differences around the age of the people that can carry out public collections and things. The Institute of Fundraising's website's the best place to go and find out information about that.
Hi, Euan Richards, Scottish Historic Buildings Trust. I liked your thoughts about not pursuing people in Hong Kong, and we have a trustee at the moment who's very much keen on pursuing people in America, but we have got somebody who's very keen, who is an American, who would like to give us some money, but is adamant he wants to give it with tax relief in America. We're a Scottish charity, we've never had a foreign donation before. How do you extract money from wealthy Americans without going down too much trouble to get there?
Who wants to have?
Do you want to? You'll be good at answering this.
So you just need a certificate of 501c3, and it's very straightforward and very easy to get, and then you can accept a donation from an American, and they can make it tax effective as well.
And that's the Charities Aid Foundation?
Well, you can also go through the Charities Aid Foundation, which is what we did, because we looked at setting up a 501c3 and thought it was probably a little bit more than we wanted to deal with. Yeah, but if you don't have anybody finding you, but you probably, if you've got somebody, it will be easier. But certainly you can also go through the Charities Aid Foundation as well.
Right, and they pay money to the Charities Aid Foundation?
Yeah, it kind of goes through them to get to you. So, yes, there is a small fee.
I think it is, but we just can't get to it.
The other alternative, as Fiona said, you need a couple of people in the States, and you can set up a 501c3, which is the tax certificate.
I think I would also add to that as with any tax efficient giving, it's important that any organisation going down that in a significant way takes the appropriate tax accountant advice as well, because you can get into one or two knots with other advice that you may seek from other sources. But once you've got your strategy in place, and indeed the forms that we've referred to here, I think it would do no harm to seek the tax advisory on that too.
Paul Norman, Heritage Business Planning. Just to back up what Ken just said, we on one occasion went down this road, and we then took a turning off the road to Chiene Tait, and they kept us straight and on the narrow, and it worked very, very effectively and very, very well. And it wasn't actually nearly as daunting as we and my trustees had imagined it was going to be.
Well, thank you for that comment. No, we didn't pay him. Not yet. Could I perhaps ask a question to the Lloyd's TSB Foundation? One thing that troubles me in a financial reporting sense is the financial presentation of financial statements. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can have a situation where a charity can appear very well endowed or very capital rich, but very often the reserves are tied or locked. How much cognizance do you take of the financial balance sheet position, and how subjective is the process in that regard?
We would look at every individual application, and we would assess, as well as what you're trying to do and it meets needs and addresses outcomes. We'd also look at the financial sustainability and how fragile that organisation was, and we would question the reserves. So in the application form, it may just ask for your cash at bank, how much your income and expenditure can be, and what your reserves policy, which doesn't actually, can sometimes be a bit not give the true reflection. So through that we would have dialogue with groups, either through a face-to-face meeting or telephone conversation, to explore that in more detail, and we would then try and unpick that. So for example, you may own a building that's been endowed to you, it looks like you've got a lot of money, but actually you could be running just meeting the bare minimum, and though we would explore that and look at, is it the money that you're needing going to make a difference? So it is something that we look at, and it's something that our assessors explore in a lot of detail to see of that. So yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor that you'd like to raise to the panel?
Elaine, a question to you. You gave an example of an organisation that was encouraged by the big lottery to apply, and you were saying if it wasn't ready, then they shouldn't apply, even if the funder asked. Does that not, if in a situation where a funder encourages you to apply, will they not look unfavourably on you if you then turn them down?
I don't think so. I think it comes back to a question of dialogue. In that one instance, the organisation had received a grant for a programme that the Big Lottery were managing, and they were thinking about what happens in the sustainability plan, and they were almost saying, oh, you can come back to us for this element or that element. And as many trusts and foundations will be, they'll encourage people to think about applying to them, come forward. And through conversation with that group, it became very apparent that they didn't probably have the understanding of the need. They probably didn't have the understanding of what they didn't really know what they wanted to apply to for the Big Lottery. So there was lots of questions in there that actually, well, the Big Lottery was saying apply to us in a general sense, and the group took that in good faith. When you started to explore it in more detail, they weren't ready. So I was almost sort of saying, don't put the time and effort in just now, because you're not ready and you're likely to get be unsuccessful, which you'll probably feel disappointed at. You've probably spent quite a lot of time trying to develop something that isn't at the right stage, and then be unsuccessful, not get the money. Wait, think about what you need. They won't, won't put that as a disadvantage against you. They'll probably say, actually, you'll probably end up with a better success because you've taken the time, thought more about what you need, and said, actually, I didn't apply at this stage because we weren't ready, or I had a few more questions. I'd rather wait and come back later. And funders appreciate that. They appreciate that people come and saying, I know I thought about putting an application in, but actually when I looked at it, we weren't at the right stage. And it's that open dialogue for you to understand this isn't right, but it could be 6 months, 12 months down the line. And I think that's what I was trying to get across through that.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Linda Sesford, Teapot Trust. We're a very young, new charity. We've only been going 3 years, and we find ourselves in a situation of almost a catch-22 of having to spend a lot of time to try and raise money to grow, but we don't really have the time because we've only got 3 people part-time in the office. We don't have the luxury, unfortunately, of a fundraising team or anything like that. Any tips as to how you get over that type of hurdle? Because it's core costs are being eaten into in trying to do grant applications, funding, all sorts of things.
Leslie, could I ask you to respond?
I'm going to come back and say volunteers, because actually that is so important. I mean, the SCVO are definitely worth approaching. But also, I mean, do you have a board of governors? Yeah, have a chat with them. Back to who they know. What could they do? How could they get involved? And actually see if you can get them lined up. The other thing that I mean, it's funding as well, but whether you could afford even to bring in somebody almost on a sort of consultancy basis as a trust fundraiser to actually get you going. I know Lukey House did that when they first branched out on their own. The trustees were vital, but also they looked at who they could bring on a sort of short-term contract to really push the major gift side and push trust fundraising. And that it helped because it got them over that kind of short-term hurdle until they could get things set up. Totally, yeah.
I could perhaps add to that in that I'm a trustee of a small charity as well, and they don't have a fundraising team. But echoing what Leslie has just said, working the Board of Governors, the network, the fundraising ideas, and not accepting that we don't know anybody, but also picking up on what Leslie has said, we have employed, I'm not sure if it's professional fundraiser, but it's certainly an ad hoc trust approach type individual who will go out, assess our case and take it to as many. And there's a contingency in that and also a small retainer, but it does give flexibility and indeed at this point some outcomes that we're quite pleased with. So there are options, I think, to be flexible and also get your...
I know that for small organisations, fundraisers can seem a luxury and you spend all your time filling in grant applications, doing the annual reports and not doing the actual work. The other thing to think about is with trusts and foundations, as well as getting money to deliver services, there's a lot of organisations now that will look at capacity building support, and some of that will be about fundraising strategies, helping you think about how to maximise your resources, thinking about strategies like that. So you might want to explore that kind of avenue as well, that you can get some support in that route as well. Volunteers is a good way, but also potentially some interns, so linking with local colleges or universities. If someone's got an interest in sort of business development or third sector, they could come along and help you, and they could do some of the sort of legwork as well around scouting out what are the most appropriate trusts and foundations for you. So there's other areas of getting more capacity in-kind support as well, but I do appreciate the challenge. I hear it a lot about that balance.
Any other questions from the floor?
Jill Frank, Sport Aberdeen. There's been quite a lot of reference in the presentations this evening around demonstrating outcomes, particularly in relation to grant applications. Do you consider that to be a sort of formal process through some sort of social return on investment calculation, or are you referring to something else?
Back to Elaine.
No, we don't use social return on investment as a method. We basically, in simple language, want to understand the positive difference that you're making and how you're going to measure that. So that can be anything from ensuring that you capture feedback from people that are participating in your services, that maybe local partners you're linking to are, continuing to engage with you and they give feedback on the difference it's made for maybe some of their clients. So if, for example, the work we do is around children and young people, we might get feedback from, we would ask funded groups to give us information from local social workers or the teachers to see actually that support's really helped Leslie because she's now participating better in school. So it's all about that demonstrating of good. And I think if you start from that basis, measuring the difference at a very low level that's manageable for yourself, and then you can build on much more sophisticated and complicated structures such as social return on investment, which does take a lot of time. You need skilled assessors and everything. And I don't think many trusts and foundations are going down that specific avenue. I think what they want is better understand the difference their money is making. An organisation like Evaluation Support Scotland their website's easy to find. You just put in ESS, or Evaluation Support Scotland, provide lots of really practical help and assistance to voluntary organisations around the measurement of outcomes, particularly the kind of qualitative stuff, the things that are quite hard to demonstrate, that real difference that you see for people that you're working with.
One final question, or are we all exhausted? If there's no further questions, I think we're at the point where we will close the formalities for this evening. So all that's left for me is to, on your behalf, ask you to thank each of our speakers. So thank you to Euan, to Fiona, to Elaine, and to Leslie for the uplifting message at the end. So can I ask you to thank our speakers? Can I ask you to take the time, please, to complete the evaluation forms that should be in your packs, because we do value your feedback. And I'm reliably assured that drinks are in the Cullen suite up the stairs, so you need to follow Kerry, who's at the door to my right. And please remember to take your coats and brollies with you, please. It'll make it easier for your exit. So thank you.